Hello and welcome to the Cosmos with an introduction to Reformed Theology. I'm Jack Baines and I have with me my good friend and Reformed Christian Ben Hanley. Hi Ben. First question for you, what is Reformed Theology?
Reformed theology is a theological framework that emerged out of the Protestant Reformation. With the influential works of John Calvin, Reformed theology is represented by Anglican, Presbyterian, and some congregational traditions. It seeks to emphasize the authority of Scripture, the sovereignty of God, and the power of God's grace.
Oh wow, goodness me, that sounds interesting. Now what I've learned about predestination is an acronym TULIP, and in my theology degree I have looked at this as a centre of Calvinism, so what I want to know is, could you remind the viewers what TULIP is, and do you think it represents Reformed theology fairly?
Yeah, it's an acronym originating in the 17th century as being the 5 points against Arminianism, which is a theology that contested some of the Reformed theology in regards to the understanding of grace, sovereignty, and predestination. T stands for total depravity, the understanding that in our original sin we can never be made right with God by our own works. U is for unconditional election, the understanding that it is election made through God's decision and that we merely follow God's sovereign will. L is for limited atonement, one of the more debated points of Reformed theology, suggesting Christ's death was intended to secure the salvation of the elect, which is the predestined saints. I is the irresistible grace, speaking of the power of God's grace being so great that anyone called by it cannot reject Christ. P is for the perseverance of the saints, which holds that those who truly are saved through the power of God's grace cannot ultimately fall away from salvation. Whilst the traditional TULIP acronym represents many of the key points of Calvinism, it by no means represents the entirety of the theological framework, missing out key points on sacramentology and covenant theology, talking about child baptism, the spiritual presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. So in general, I would say it covers some key points, but it doesn't really cut it.
Okay, now that makes some sense. Now, it was a theological tradition in the 16th century. Calvin would have been one of the reformers, and the main reformers started it, but there were also people like Zwingli and Vermigli, I believe, who would have done well to prop it up, and John Knox. But because it's in the 16th century, what I want to know, should I agree with it? Is it perhaps outdated, perhaps? Is that what you're saying with this question? I'm just wanting to know how seriously should I take this?
Yeah, I think you should take it completely seriously. I think whilst it was in the 16th century, it emerged out of the 16th century. There's so much more to it. Because the Reformed tradition emphasized the understandings of faith. It did not invent these concepts, but sought to re-establish them in a time where Protestant theology moved away from aspects of some corrupted theology. Reformed theology emphasized sola scriptura, the principle that theology can be determined by scripture alone. Sola Christus, that is, to be Christ-focused. Sola fide, through faith alone. Sola gratia, through grace alone. And solio Deo gloria, for the glory of God. This is a sound biblical framework by which theology can be informed.
Wow. Now, in conversations we've had as friends, I've also learned that you have Baptist influences, and yet you talk about being reformed or choosing reformed theology. I want to know, can Calvinists be Baptists? How can you make that work? etc. Is this possible?
Very much depends on who you speak to on this one. It's a debated subject within both Baptist and Reformed circles. Well, as a Baptist, it is a great question. Currently, we see a great emphasis on Reformed theology, represented by predestination and the points of TULIP, which I previously mentioned. And Baptists can agree with them. However, as I mentioned, the emphasis on sacramentology may not actually agree with general Baptist theology. Baptists' key tenets are infant baptism isn't biblically based, as as only people who are professing a personal faith can be baptized in the Baptist tradition, as it is a profession of faith being often considered more symbolic in some churches. There is sometimes a lower emphasis of the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper. These points would be points that Baptists may hold would be opposed to the elements of Reformed theology. But an interesting case is Baptists who hold to the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. They would be considered more Reformed due to explicitly agreeing with the 5 points of that's TULIP, and adopting a covenantal theology. But if Baptists can truly be considered Reformed, is affected by which parts you believe Reformed theology emphasizes.
Nice. Well, thanks, Ben. That was quite an insight into Reformed and Baptist theology. Yes, so if any of you have an interesting theological topic and have a degree of expertise or know someone who does, please do get in contact with me. ToTheCosmos7 is my Instagram handle. Yes, and thanks so much, Ben, for this amazing interview. Stay tuned for an interview next week, and yes, have a good week overall. Bye!